you got to ask yourself, and I'm thinking as a teacher now as well, JP and Nate, and I felt this way as a teacher as well. You have a curriculum to get through, so we can make the comparison in education as well. Would our students, players, perform better if we covered 75% of the recommended content well, or would they perform better if we covered 100% of it quickly so we can get it done?
Would our players perform better if we covered 75% of the plan well, or 100% of it quickly so we can get it done? Gosh, Alan and Simon, these guys ask some really great questions, and this one really stuck with me from today's episode. I started to think about all the practices that I've experienced as a coach when things weren't going well. Like, players didn't seem to be getting what I was trying to teach. When we were competing, they weren't applying what we had just taught and worked on. But yet, I continue on with the plan. I charge on. I have to stick to the plan. I've got to get all that work in, or else the team will get behind. That's the story I tell myself in those practices. And in reality, it's a very limiting belief. Now, in today's episode, we go back to our conversation with Alan Keane and Simon Turner from Mvmt Sports and unpacked the do and review parts to the plan, do, review process. And I'm excited because I know this is going to challenge many of our listeners, which we like to do on the Coaching Culture podcast. We like to challenge you. So welcome back to the podcast. If you're a new listener, my name's JP Nurbin, and I'm joined by my co-host and friend, Nate Sanderson. The podcast is brought to you by TOC Culture Consulting, which I founded over 5 years ago because I wanted to help coaches grow as leaders and build better cultures. If you want some help beyond this podcast, head on over to tocculture.com. You can learn more about how we help coaches through mentorship and online education. Also, you can subscribe to our newsletter to get the coaching notes for this podcast and a host of other free tools for coaches. Now let's get into the second part of our conversation with Alan Keane and Simon Turner.
I think next we're going to jump into the do aspect here, the second phase of our process here. And I want to ask this question here, Simon. One of the things that coaches often come back to, and whether it's my assistant coaches or other coaches that I've worked with, is how much flexibility do you have with the plan when you're actually executing, the practice or the approach in a particular game? And I think there are some coaches out there that, I know that plan practice to the exact minute, and they've got all the POEs and there's staples in their practice plans, and they're carrying them into the gym. And then there's others that, maybe just have a few headings on a note card and they're just responding to what they see, players being able to do. So what guidance would you give as a coach is using the plan and yet trying to be the most effective for what their team needs in that particular game or practice?
Well, Nate, the plan, do, review cycle can be completed simultaneously. So we can be doing a plan, do, review process for every period of the season. Preseason, for example, we're going to review at the end of preseason. We've got our plan. We're going to review at the end before the first game. Playoffs, another period of the season. So you can be halfway through that plan, do, review cycle whilst also being halfway through a week plan, do, review cycle, which is we got 4 practices this week and we're going to review on Friday, or after the game on Saturday, we're going to review the entire week. Then you can also be halfway through a daily plan, do, review cycle at the same time, which is this one practice session or this one game. And then even within that practice session, you can be doing some quick reviews in the middle of that practice. And Alan does this really well, particularly if you set targets. If you plan targets at the beginning of your game or practice, and then you get to a water break, you check the targets and you ask, are we achieving these targets? Are we where we want to be at this point in the practice? And if the answer to that is no, well, then the next question is, what changes do we need to make? And then you change your practice plan on the fly. And that's where the creativity of the coach comes in. Now, if you're a coach that plans down to the minute, like you got 6-minute drills and every drill's got a name, the Nate Sanderson drill and the Northern Iowa drill. And we've all heard them, haven't we? The Duke drill, that whatever, Syracuse. if you're planning down to the minute, you just lose that flexibility. And can I add to that too? We work with coaches all around the world. I mean, we've got coaches we support in the UK, Australia, Canada, the US. I have to say it's quite North American to plan down to the minute. It's almost like it's a high school, college coach with a volunteer manager on the clock, and the clock is literally ticking down for every drill because we got to get on to the next thing. Because we hear a lot from coaches in those contexts of, oh, I'm under so much, we got so much to put in. You've ever heard that in the preseason? Oh, we're putting in so much. I don't know if we're ever going to get there. Maybe you're putting in a little too much. If you can't put it all in, then maybe you shouldn't be putting it all in. So that flexibility is really, really important. And I remember observing a coaching session in Belgrade, 2004. I was on a little study tour. It was in an old school gym. Half the court had been ripped up, right? Literally the wood was ripped up. So these guys were practicing in half the court. It was a health and safety nightmare. They've got these young players. It's a semi-professional team full of mostly young players. So it's like an under 23 kind of team. And these coaches, they're just incredible. Like Serbian coaches, for example, they're just so adaptable because their context is changing all the time. They can plan really quickly and they can be really creative within a session. And if we're too fixed and we're timing every drill and we've got a manager on the clock, then there's limited room for creativity. And Alan does a great job calling player timeouts. He allows the players to call a timeout. Hold on, coach, we need a timeout. And in that time, he leaves the players, and we frequently have a little coach's timeout at the same time. So there's different cycles and lengths of the plan do review process.
One of the things that, as I'm hearing you talk about this plan and down to the minute, that was me, Simon. I would have it down to, 2:53, it was literally to the minute. I think in reflection, the plan handcuffed me because I wasn't able to be creative because, we had to get things done. We had to move on to the next thing. We had to hurry up, I couldn't, we had to, and that affected who I was as a coach in those moments, and typically in a negative way. And it's great to be efficient. It's great to be assertive. It's great to push your team, I think, but I could definitely reflect on and go, ooh, the times that I started losing my patience, and I was short with a player, and not who I wanted to be or who I needed to be for my team, was because I was, restricted. I was handcuffed by this plan. At the same time, there is a challenge for any coach, especially younger coaches, or even, I was coaching last year and I was coaching a new offense, system of play that I was not confident in, or really honestly that competent in. And I really had to rely on the plan. I couldn't make adjustments on the fly because of my lack of confidence and competence. So I guess I'm just kind of curious about that. If you or Alan have any thoughts on that, it's like, yeah, I want to be more free flowing as a coach. I'm sure some coaches are saying that, but at the end of the day, like the plan is kind of like my safety blanket. If I don't have that there, then I might lose that confidence.
Really interesting, JP. And in our research, I'll share with you actually. I won't say who the coach was out of respect for the coach, and not that he did anything wrong. It was just fascinating. I was having a conversation with loads of coaches when we were doing some research around, like, how do you practice plan? How do you game plan? Like, coaches in all four corners of the world. And I couldn't even remember how many guys. It was over 100 for sure. And one coach said to me, he said, Alan, I don't plan. I don't use a game day plan. Like, you see us with the sheets on the side, the game day card. And he said, because I don't want my mind to be anchored to what I pre-game planned. I wanted my creative juices to not be restricted. And I wanted to adjust to what I was seeing in front of me. Now, he also did say to me, I wouldn't have been able to do that up to, if this was more than 5-10 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to do that. He is a very, very experienced coach, being there, done it, at the highest level. multiple championships. So he's had all kinds of experiences. So he said he's at the stage of his career where actually planning something in game, like the game day card, would actually restrict him. But he said he would have embraced it for sure in his younger years. So I thought that was an interesting perspective, actually. What Simon spoke about, and I've been on the end of that as well, guys. Had people on the table doing the clock. It was minute by minute. If we didn't get through the plan, I saw the session as a failure. I saw me as a failure. If we got through the session plan, I was going home happy, regardless how the session went. We covered this, we covered that. And it gave me a sense of security. As a younger coach, it gave me a feeling of security. We're going into the European Championships, and we've covered all those different areas. I felt good. The reality was the players struggled. The players were confused. The players were really saturated, and their working memory couldn't cope with everything we did. So then we're not performing, and it's a vicious cycle. I get frustrated. The players are losing confidence. We're not getting the results that everybody desires. And if you peel it back to what was the biggest issue, the biggest issue was my planning as the head coach. Actually, I gave them too much that they were able to cope with. So the practice plan itself, Simon, and maybe you could talk on this a little bit, we've actually upgraded it from its original format. Its original format, and Simon will clarify, it actually had more sections to plan for. It's now got, I believe, 8 different sections. So it's got 8 sections to write whatever you want to do in your practice in. But a while back when we first started, it had like 12 sections. And, you got to ask yourself, and I'm thinking as a teacher now as well, JP and Nate, and I felt this way as a teacher as well. You have a curriculum to get through, so we can make the comparison education as well. Would our students, players, perform better if we covered 75% of the recommended content well, or would they perform better if we covered 100% of it quickly so we can get it done? Which would they perform better at? My experience in both worlds is covering less and covering it better facilitates a better performance.
I think it's worth noting that in order to innovate and be creative, you need a base. So now you can do it from a blank slate and just be a bit of a renegade. Be the coach that's emerged from a cave, and they're just all of a sudden coaching, basketball or whatever. But that doesn't exist, right? So we've all got a base of knowledge. So that really experienced coach that actually doesn't want to plan so much anymore, I would argue that for that person, they are planning. They're maybe not needing to write it down as much as earlier on in their career, but their plan is probably really simple. They've got like 4 sections in their practice plan, and that's it. Or they might even write down 5v5, but they're so experienced that they know all sorts of conditions, and they recognize that we're not getting the ball, we're not penetrating the defense at all. So they'll put in a condition within the 5-on-5. They'll just recognize it and they'll say, right, we have to get the ball in the lane at least twice before we can shoot. And that's just a condition that they've added to a 5-on-5 game in response to their observations during a session. So when you're really experienced, you can do it like that. It looks like they're on the fly, just like a musician might look like they're jamming or making it up, but that musician's been training their whole life to enable them to then be innovative, to enable them to then not have to overthink it. But you have to get to that point through quite a lot of diligent work. It's also worth noting, I think, that sometimes our targets for a session get a bit skew with. Sometimes they're just a summary of what I'm going to do in the session. Like 3 targets for a session, and we'll write down number 1, transition defense. But that's not it. That's a target. That's just a subject area. That's just, so sometimes our targets are a summary of the drills we're going to do, because actually probably already, have you ever written a session plan and then gone back up to the top and then written the targets? I've done that many times, right? Where if you start with the targets, then it gives you a framework. And so you can innovate within your session plan, Nate, like you were describing earlier on, if it's still meeting the targets. Because if the primary driver is to meet the 3 targets you set for the session, then that gives you license and, in fact, empowerment to innovate and change the session on the fly because you're working towards those 3 targets. So I would argue the targets shouldn't change, but the drills, games, activities you're going to do, they can change during a session if the targets aren't being met. one of the ways Alan and I differ is when I write targets. Every one of my targets starts with the word introduce, develop, or perform. So what are we introducing? What are we developing? What are we performing? And that's just, based on, I think, probably something I learned from Alan about teaching speeds. And so Alan writes I've noticed, Alan, you write quite detailed targets, brackets, we're going to work on this, and this, and this. Because you're able to conceptualize these things because you're so much further advanced than I am. You're able to see the connections between all these things and cover off different aspects of our defense within one drill or game, whereas I have to be much more specific. Okay, we're working on helping the helper in our half court defense, and so that becomes develop helping the helper in half court D is my target. So for me, it's much more narrow and specific, but for somebody of Alan's experience, it can be much wider and a little bit more conceptual. Last thing I want to add to that is one of the ways in which I see coaches could develop, could widen their perspective, is to include a wider range of targets. So if you've got 3 targets for a session and all 3 of them are tactical, and you've done that for the last 5 practice sessions in a row, then that's evidence that you've been really tactical in your focus. Could you have a social target within that? Alan talks a lot about task cohesion. So the extent to which the group of people are performing a task in a cohesive way. Could you have a social target? Could there be preseason? Is there a physical target? What are your technical targets? Could you have one tactical target and then an associated physical or technical target that backs up the tactical target, and then an associated social target that backs up the tactical target? So a practical example I talked about before, helping the helper in half court D, that might be your overarching number 1 tactical target. The technical is being able to say, hold your stance, point your hands, maintain vision of the ball and your attacker at the same time. And then the social target is the strategic targeted communication between teammates and a feeling of togetherness. And that's a way of stitching together those 3 targets. And if that was your overall set of targets and it wasn't being achieved during a practice, then it would become quite obvious, I would have thought, if you're doing a mini coach's timeout as you go along, hey, we need to innovate, we need to change something here and abandon and maybe the volunteer manager is going to be a little redundant for the next half an hour.
And I'm really thinking through the lens now of, I have a wonderful job with Bermuda Blaze. I work with, Simon's brought me on board to work with the club's coaches, coach development, let's say. What these guys don't know is I'm developing as much as they are by trying to develop them. Which is incredibly unique because I get access to all their practice plans, their game cards. I'll do a lot of reviews with them, like audio reviews, hot reviews, as you talked about earlier, JP. So I'm thinking through their lens as Simon is talking there, and I'm taking off this GB under 20 professional head coach's hat. I'm thinking through the hat or through the lens of a junior development coach who sees his players or her players twice a week, 3 times a week. And I think those targets are huge because if you don't start with that, you're just basically, scrummaging around the place trying to see what you can find, and you're doing a bit of this, a bit of that, and you see a lovely drill on Twitter. Oh, that's great. Let's do that drill in next week's practice. And then, when you peel all that back and you say, what is it? It's actually a disservice to your players because they all showed up to have fun and to get better and improve and different things like that. So I say to a lot of younger coaches or less experienced coaches, if I could say like that, please, I say to them, this tactical element you're practicing for, absolutely fine. That's target number 1, no problem. But what supports that tactical element you're planning for? So, it stimulates a great conversation and it lends itself towards, well, technically they need to be able to do that X, Y, and Z. Okay, great. So what do they need to be able to technically execute X, Y, and Z? Oh, they've got to be physically able to do this. Okay, great. So they're not going to be very competent at it. So how do they need to feel in order to do it well? Oh, they need to feel safe, freedom to make errors. a freedom of consequence to failure. They need to feel free and open and brave to go and try it. Great. There's your targets, buddy. You've started with your tactical, but what underpins it? Now plan for a technical aspect that supports the tactical. Now plan for a physical part of the session that's going to support the technical, and then surround that by, safe space to try stuff. And I think a lot of times when I watch coaches coach and they do their practice plan, and I talked about the Twitter trap, I like to call it, where you see these drills and plays and stuff. You've got to be very mindful that actually the tactical may not come off because they're not technically able, but the technical ability is going to struggle because of a physical inability. So what Simon talked about, targeting, having targets or keys to your practice, or whatever people call it, having physical, social, mental, technical, like what do they need in order to get better in that practice? And you can have all three, you can have all four. I don't think that way, JP, with a senior pro team or a GB under 20s, because of the context. Because at 20 years old, you're a national team player. I'm getting physical, competent athletes, superb physical capabilities. I actually have to find a way to get them to do what I want them to do together. So a lot of it does become the social. You do plan the social at that level, and you should be. So Simon talked about task cohesion. They've got to be able to do stuff together. And then obviously the tactical being the outcome of that.
Well, Alan, I think all of that kind of lends ourselves to transitioning here to the review process, because it would seem like common sense that once you have your objectives, or however you want to describe those, at the your plan of the tactical, the technical, the physical, the cultural, emotional, social, what have you, the natural response to that would be at the end say, well, how did we do? Right? I mean, we wanted to get better at post-feed entries. Did we create the right environment? Did we see improvement? Did their confidence in being able to, throw that pass increase or not? Right. And so talk a little bit about, because I do think, as JP said in the opener here, this is probably the least of the three, that coaches are really engaging in an intentional process to review it, whether it's their in-game coaching or it's, their plan for practice and then their execution. So maybe start us at a beginner level a little bit here. One of our coaches was saying, no, that makes sense to plan this way, to execute this way, and then to review. What's the entry level, process for somebody to kind of reflect on their practices for the first time?
Well, I'll talk you through the titles of our review framework, Nate, so the listeners can have a visual of what you're actually reviewing. And then I'm going to relate it back to my PE teaching days, 15, maybe 20 years ago. But the titles are my coaching. So you review your coaching. And that, of course, comes under that. Inside that is your preparation, your energy level, and your communication clarity. The second thing that you review, the next thing on that sheet of paper, on the back of your plan, or your do, should I say, is the player experience. We actually review the level of fun they had. Was it from low to high? And then we also review the player's problem solving. Was that low or high? And then the last thing in the player experience is communication between players. So we're reviewing those 6 elements to do with our coaching and the player experience. The next thing we review is what we were grateful for. And it's titled gratitude. And there's 3 sentences to say what you were grateful for, or what did you enjoy and appreciate about the session, you as the coach. The next 2 phases go a long way towards helping you plan what you need to do in the next session. So the next segment is just simply called development. What did we learn, and what will we change? And that tees you up nicely for the next practice. And then there's a note section at the end, where we can write in, were the targets met? What went well? What do I need to remember for the next session? So it's framed that way. I have to share with you at this point a story in my PE teacher training days, probably 17, 18 years ago, which makes me feel incredibly old, guys. When I was training in a school in West London, my PE teaching mentor said to me, he was the head of the department at the school. I finished teaching a lesson, and feedback afterwards, how I got the feedback, we won't get into that, but it was very much one way. But he did ask me a really pertinent question that has lived with me ever since. And he said, before we get into the lesson and your planning and the outcomes and the delivery, he said, I want to ask you one question. Did the students have fun? And it really threw me off, because I'd been teacher training for 6 months at that point, and no teacher's lesson I had covered who'd given me feedback had ever asked me, what did they have fun? And he said to me, Alan, if you learn anything from this placement, this experience, you need to know that these students need to have fun above everything else. It has to be the foundation of what you're doing. Now, obviously, you layer that foundation with obviously having to teach and making sure they're learning and acquiring new skills and knowledge. But the fact that we review the player experience, and the first thing on that player experience is the fun level of that session, I think that should live inside in every single practice session, from an under 8 right through to a professional men's team, right through to a European Championship team. Because I've been in both worlds, and without that fun factor, it's a very, very long and difficult season.
I really appreciate that story, Alan. We recently had a rugby coach in the podcast, Andre Pretorius, and he was talking about his vision for his team being, he wanted his team, a pro rugby team, to be the best part of their day for all the players, part of that program. That really resonates kind of to what you're talking about here. At the end of the day, is kind of reflecting on the experience, right? Did they actually experience that? And that's something, we have these vision statements, but do we reflect on them on a daily basis? The experience. And I know every coach listening to this podcast really values the experience their athletes are having, and also love the gratitude thing, because I think it's so oftentimes it's very easy for us to go negative as coaches, and especially the dog days of the season. Okay, I'm going to cut myself off there. Next episode, we're going to dive deeper into the review process with Simon and Alan. We're going to really discuss how we can engage other coaches and players in the review process, and also how do we complete this loop, this learning cycle loop. Don't miss an episode of the podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen. Also follow Simon and Alan on Twitter. There's some great stuff there, and you can head over to mvmtsports.com, mvmtsports.com, where you can buy their plan, do, reflection tools. We'll also put a link to their website and their Twitter in the details of this episode.